Akaroa did almost become a French colony. But the popular idea that there was a race for Akaroa is an exaggeration. I'm Lynda Wallace, Director of the Akaroa Museum. The story of French settlement started way back in 1838 when a French whaler, Jean Longois, sailed into Littleton Harbour and negotiated a dubious purchase for Banks Peninsula from local Maori. He paid a deposit of 150 francs, paid in goods, hats, shirts, trousers and a pistol. Longois returns to France and he obtains support for this venture. They obtained a ship, which they called the Comte de Paris. It was outfitted and they set about finding settlers who were willing to give up their lives in France. Accompanying the Comte de Paris was a French naval vessel, the Orbe, under the command of Captain Charles Laveau. And it had been sent to New Zealand to both look after the interests of the settlers and check on the whalers who were operating here. What they don't know is that back in New Zealand in February 1840, a couple of months earlier, the Treaty of Waitangi had been signed. The British had assumed sovereignty and control of New Zealand, and it meant that they were arriving in a country that they had no hope of colonising. The first inkling that the French had that the British had already declared sovereignty over New Zealand was when Captain Laveau pulled into the Bay of Islands on his arrival in New Zealand and met Governor Hobson. Hobson felt it might be a good precaution to send a naval ship, a British naval ship, to Banks Peninsula, just to make doubly sure that anyone from a foreign national coming into Akaroa Harbour was in no doubt that the British were here first. In August 1840 then, there were two warships headed for Banks Peninsula, one English, one French. It was this trip from the Bay of Islands to Banks Peninsula that has given rise to the idea or the exaggeration of a race for Akaroa, because these two captains were coming to Banks Peninsula as quickly as they possibly could. The Britomart came into Akaroa Harbour on the 10th of August 1840 without any French presence. Although Captain Laveau of the Orbe knew that British sovereignty had been declared, the settlers on the Comte de Paris didn't. As the passengers on the Comte de Paris sailed up the harbour, they must have been so disappointed to find the Union Jack flying from this flagpole. Those French and German settlers, they were mostly poor people, desperate people, and they came to Akaroa with very few possessions. They were promised 5 acres of land when they arrived here. It was surveyed in long, skinny sections that ran up the hills. Already in Akaroa, there were British settlers. We're standing in the French end of town. The British had established themselves at the other end, down there near the main wharf.
Were the French a majority?
If you add in the crew of the Orbe to the settlers, yes, they were certainly in the majority for a few years in the 1840s. It took a few years to work it out, but the French settlers were allowed to retain their lands that they'd been allocated, their 5 acres, and most of them stayed. But they'd found themselves in a British-run place. The Lalive family were among the most successful of the French settlers. Francois Lalive had a large family, established a really successful farm here. Many generations later, Francois Lalibre's descendants achieved the heights of Kiwi success. One became an All Black, another a Miss New Zealand. Akaroa's French history is very important in terms of the appeal of the town to visitors. We've got a population of about 750 last census, but 60% of the houses are holiday houses. The French street names started in the early 1960s as Akaroa District Promotions initiative to attract more tourists to the town and play on its Frenchness. Some of the authentic details that are French in this town are just intangible and no one's going to notice. For example, Laveau Street was laid out by the French according to French convention, 12 metres wide. The only survivor of any French-built buildings in the centre of town is this one, attached to Akaroa Museum, the Longwa Teveno house, built on this site in the early 1840s. Notice the windows with their external shutters. You can see a little tilt out to the eaves at the base. That's a hipped roof. Again, that was a common feature of the French-built buildings. Remember, they were quite poor and they built very small, modest wooden houses. Madame Teveno was one of the first people to live here. She was one of the oldest settlers to arrive on the Comte de Paris in 1840. She passed it on to her daughter, who passed it on to her daughter. And there's our telltale sign of pit-sawn timber, evidence of the age of this house. It's part of the museum. In fact, we consider it one of our most precious collection items. The French story is very important to Akaroa still. It's unique in New Zealand. There is no other town in New Zealand where there was an attempt at a French settlement.